Welcome to the Crazy Alchemist podcast, where alchemy, occultism, and strange history come alive.
On the morning of the 2nd of July, 1951, a landlady named Pansy Carpenter knocked on the door of her tenant in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, Florida. She was delivering a telegram. No one answered. The doorknob was hot to the touch. When police finally broke in, they found the remains of an armchair reduced to its coil springs. Inside the springs lay a small heap of ashes, a piece of spine, and a left foot, still wearing its black satin slipper. Near the foot was a shrunken object that the officers could not identify at first. It turned out to be the skull of the tenant, 67-year-old Mary Hardy Reeser, reduced to the approximate size of a teacup. The rest of the apartment was barely touched. A stack of newspapers on a nearby table had not caught fire. Candles on a shelf had melted from the top down, but the wicks were intact. The wall outlet behind the chair had fused, stopping the clock at 4:20 in the morning. The FBI investigated for 7 days. They found no accelerants. The greasy yellow residue coating the walls and ceiling was identified as rendered human body fat. Dr. Wilton Krogman, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Pennsylvania, was called in to consult. He had spent his entire career watching what fire does to the human body, for the FBI, for the military, for criminal courts. He had seen hundreds of cremations. He wrote a letter to a colleague about Reeser that said, "I cannot conceive of such complete cremation without more burning of the apartment itself. If I had been living in the Middle Ages, I would have muttered something about black magic." This is the story of spontaneous human combustion, and it is stranger and older and more resolved than most people realize. Let me start with what the phenomenon actually is and how old it really is, because most popular accounts get this wrong from the first sentence. You will read in some books that spontaneous human combustion is an ancient phenomenon going back to Pliny, to the Old Testament, to the alchemists. None of that holds up. Pliny the Elder cataloged every strange death he could find, and he never mentioned a person igniting from inside. The fire from heaven in the Old Testament, Elijah and the priests of Baal, Sodom, the company of Korah, is divine fire coming from above, not internal combustion. The alchemists spoke of an inner fire, an ignis in naturalis, but they meant it as a metaphor for spiritual transformation, not as a physical mechanism. As a named medical category, spontaneous human combustion really begins in the 17th century with a Danish physician named Thomas Bartholin, writing in 1654. Bartholin recorded the story of a Milanese knight who supposedly belched fire after drinking strong wine and burned to death in front of his parents. Bartholin was writing 150 years after the alleged event. There is no contemporaneous documentation. The category is specifically early modern. It is not ancient. Anyone who tells you otherwise is projecting backwards. The first case to enter the scientific literature was a countess. On the morning of the 14th of March, 1731, a maid walked into the bedchamber of Countess Cornelia Zangari Bandi in Cesena, Italy, and found a scene that would be reported across Europe. The 62-year-old countess had been reduced to a heap of ashes and greasy soot. Her legs from the knees down were intact, still wearing their stockings. 3 blackened fingers lay beside the pile. A foul yellow liquid coated the walls and ceiling. A small oil lamp near the body was empty but unbroken. Paul Raleigh, a Fellow of the Royal Society in London, published the case in the Philosophical Transactions in 1746. And with that publication, the pattern was set. For the next 3 centuries, almost every alleged case of spontaneous human combustion would show the same 4 features: near total destruction of the torso, preservation of the extremities, especially the lower legs and feet, minimal damage to the surrounding room, and a greasy yellow residue coating nearby surfaces. Let me walk you through the landmark cases because you need the shape of the evidence before we can talk about what it means. In 1966, a meter reader named Don Gosnell walked into the home of a 92-year-old retired physician named John Irving Bentley in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. He noticed a sweet smell and a blue haze. In the bathroom, he found a hole roughly 2.5 feet wide, burned clean through the floor. In the basement below, a pile of ashes. And beside the hole, resting on the unburned edge of the floorboards, was Bentley's right leg from the knee down, still wearing its slipper. Bentley's walking frame stood next to the hole, its rubber tips barely scorched. In 1970, in Dublin, an 89-year-old widow named Margaret Hogan was found nearly totally consumed in her own front room, with a coal fire smoldering a few feet away in the grate. The inquest returned a verdict of death by burning, cause unknown. In 1980, police were called to a council house in Ebb Vale, South Wales. Inside, in front of an armchair, they found a heap of ash, a skull, and the lower legs of 73-year-old Henry Thomas still wearing socks inside the trouser legs. The television set 12 feet away had its plastic control knobs melted. Plastic flowers on the table had liquefied. The rest of the room was undisturbed. In 1982, in Edmonton, North London, a 61-year-old woman named Jeannie Saffin was sitting in the kitchen with her elderly father when he saw a flash of light from the corner of his eye. He turned to find his daughter engulfed in flames. She died 8 days later. The coroner issued an open verdict and said flatly, there is no such thing as spontaneous human combustion. In 1986, in Crown Point, New York, the son of a 58-year-old retired firefighter named George Mott found his father's remains in the bedroom of a small house. Mott was reduced to ash and bone splinters. The bed was burned. The television and bedside phone had melted. The windows were browned by smoke. A box of wooden matches a few feet away had not ignited. The Mott case became a fixture of the spontaneous combustion literature, and almost every account of it leaves out one detail. Mott had emphysema. He was on an oxygen pump. The pump was still running when his body was found. An oxygen-enriched environment changes everything about what counts as a small ignition source. A single ember in a bedroom full of pure oxygen becomes a localized inferno. And then we get to the most famous modern case, the 22nd of December, 2010. A 76-year-old retiree named Michael Faherty was found burned to death in his sitting room in Galway, Ireland. The fire damage was confined to the body, the floor beneath him, and the ceiling above. There was an open fireplace nearby, but forensic investigators could not establish how a spark could have traveled to ignite his clothing. The Irish coroner Ciaran McLaughlin ruled the death a case of spontaneous combustion. It was the first such ruling in Irish legal history. It was also, 15 years later, still the only one anywhere in the world. There is one more case you should know about, because almost no one remembers it got solved. The 17th of September, 2017. A 70-year-old retired Irish builder named John Nolan was walking down Orchard Place in Haringey, North London, in broad daylight, when bystanders saw him burst into flames. People ran out of nearby buildings with coats and water. He was airlifted to hospital and died the next day with 65% third-degree burns. The British papers ran it as the latest spontaneous combustion case. But 8 months later, the inquest was much quieter. The coroner ruled the death accidental. Nolan had been carrying a packet of cigarettes and 2 cigarette lighters on his person. The most likely sequence was that he was lighting a cigarette as he walked, and his clothing caught fire, and he may have stumbled and been unable to react in time. The retraction never reached the audience that read the original story. This is the shape of almost every spontaneous combustion case: a sensational first wave of headlines, then a quiet conventional resolution at inquest that nobody bothers to report. So what is actually going on here? For the last 30 years, the dominant scientific explanation has been something called the wick effect. And the wick effect is not a hypothesis, it is a reproducible laboratory phenomenon. The idea is deceptively simple. A clothed human body, once ignited by any external source, a cigarette, a spark, a fallen ember, can sustain its own slow combustion in much the same way that a candle burns. The clothing acts as the wick. The subcutaneous body fat, melting from the heat, seeps outward into the fabric, providing a continuous fuel supply. The result is a slow, smoldering fire, burning at relatively low temperatures, 500 to 800 degrees Fahrenheit, that can continue for 12 hours or more. That slow fire achieves near total destruction of the torso while barely affecting the rest of the room. In 1989, a forensic fire investigator named John DeHaan demonstrated this for the BBC science program QED. The episode aired on the 26th of April, 1989, and you can find it on the Internet Archive today. DeHaan wrapped a dead pig, chosen for fat content similar to a human, in a wool blanket. He put the pig in a furnished mock-up of a small sitting room with a chair, a side table, a newspaper, a small television. He poured a small amount of gasoline on the blanket as the minimal ignition source, the equivalent of a dropped cigarette. He lit it. He stood back. The pig burned for roughly 5 hours. The ambient room temperature stayed below 400 degrees Celsius. The newspaper on the side table did not catch fire. Items more than a foot or 2 away suffered only superficial heat damage. When the experiment was stopped, the pig was reduced to the characteristic pattern: ash and partial bones in the center, intact extremities at the periphery, a greasy residue coating every nearby surface. The forensic pathologist, Mike Green, who provided the medical commentary, said on camera that after watching the pig burn, he no longer considered the spontaneous combustion cases he had handled in his own career to be forensically mysterious. The pattern matched exactly. So why do the legs survive? The wick effect answer is physics. Fire rises. A seated victim's upper body sits directly above the wick, the chair cushion plus clothing plus body fat. The legs hang forward off the chair, away from the heat column. When the chair frame collapses and the body slumps, the lower legs end up on cool floor, beyond the zone of fat-fed combustion. The lower legs and feet also contain very little subcutaneous fat, so even if the heat reaches them, there is nothing for the wick effect to consume. The selective preservation that looks uncanny in the photographs is just the natural geometry of a slow, low fire burning around a body that is no longer moving. Now, the interesting thing about the science of spontaneous combustion is not the wick effect. It is the pattern of theories that have tried and failed to explain combustion from the inside out, because every 2 or 3 generations, a serious scientist looks at the casework and tries to solve it with a new molecule, and every time the chemistry is wrong in the same way. In 1800, a French naturalist named Pierre-Aimé Lair published an essay titled, in translation, On Human Combustions Produced by Long Abuse of Spirituous Liquors. He had gathered 15 reported cases and noticed they shared a profile. The victim was usually elderly, usually a woman, usually a heavy drinker living alone, usually found near a fire, usually destroyed at the torso with the extremities intact. Lair proposed a mechanism. Chronic drinking, he said, saturated the body's tissues with alcohol, which then became flammable from any small external source or, in extreme cases, from internal heat alone. By the standards of 1800, this was a reasonable hypothesis. Alcohol burns. Drinkers were observed to die in burning chairs. Lair's theory dominated European medical thinking for the next 60 years. It appeared in pharmacology textbooks. It was picked up by the temperance movement as a moral argument against drink. It is the explanation Charles Dickens reached for when he killed the character of Mr. Crook by spontaneous combustion in Bleak House. Crook is a gin-soaked rag dealer who is destroyed by the alcohol in his own tissues.
But the theory was wrong, and the man who proved it was the German chemist Justus von Liebig, one of the founders of modern organic chemistry. Liebig went into the laboratory and tested Lair directly. First, he soaked animal tissue in pure ethanol, far more than any living body could hold, and tried to ignite it. The samples burned off the surface alcohol and then went out. Tissue is roughly 60% water, and the water acted as a heat sink and quenched the flame. Second, Liebig injected live mice with ethanol until they were intoxicated and tried to set them on fire externally. The drunk mice were no more flammable than the sober ones. Their fur burned. The mice did not. Third, Liebig did the chemistry. The lower flammability limit of ethanol is roughly 3.3% vapor in air, which corresponds to a liquid concentration of about 23%. The lethal blood alcohol concentration in humans is around 0.4%. You die at 1/50th of the concentration the body would need to burn. It is physically impossible to be drunk enough to combust. Liebig published these findings in the 1850s. The alcohol theory was dead in serious scientific circles by 1860. Dickens's friend George Henry Lewis, who happened to know Liebig personally and had read the experiments, attacked the Crook scene in the press as a fault of art and a fault in literature, giving currency to a vulgar error. Dickens refused to back down. He inserted a rebuttal into the next installment of the novel. The debate raged for months in the London press, and Dickens lost. The chemistry was against him. The interesting thing is what happened next. Every 2 or 3 generations, a respectable scientist comes back to the casework and proposes the same hypothesis with a different molecule. In 2012, the British biologist Brian J. Ford revived the internal fuel theory with acetone, the ketone produced by diabetes and extreme dieting. Ford marinated pork tissue in industrial acetone and burned it in the lab. The pork burned quickly. The experiment made headlines, but the chemistry, on inspection, was the same Lair mistake. Blood acetone in even severe ketosis reaches about 0.03%, roughly 100 times too dilute to support self-sustaining combustion. The body cannot become its own fuel. Water does not burn. Whatever does the burning has to come from outside. The strongest skeptic on spontaneous combustion is a man named Joe Nickell, a senior research fellow at the Center for Inquiry who has been writing about the cases since the early 1980s. Nickell's position rests on 3 pillars, and they are worth hearing in their strongest form.
First, the victims cannot react. Across the cases, Nickell finds the same demographic. The victim is drunk, on sedatives, asleep, ill, or otherwise impaired. Mary Reeser had taken sleeping pills the night before. Faherty was elderly with mobility issues and an open fireplace beside him. Henry Thomas was 73 and likely dozing in front of the television. Nolan was 70 and may have stumbled. The pattern that the spontaneous combustion literature reads as mysterious selection of victims is, for Nickell, the pattern of who cannot brush a burning ember off their leg within a second. A conscious, able-bodied person feels heat and reacts. An unconscious or impaired person does not. The fire that would be a panicked moment for you or me becomes, for someone who cannot move, the slow, inevitable wick. Second, fire rises and bodies slump. The unburned legs and feet are not evidence of internal combustion, they are evidence of geometry. Nickell has reconstructed the crime scenes, and the pattern matches the case photographs from Reeser through Faherty. Third, and this is the deepest point, the ignition was there. The spontaneous combustion literature treats no ignition source found as if it were proven. It almost never is. In every case Nickell has reviewed, an ignition source was either found by the original investigators and downplayed in later retellings, or was almost certainly consumed by the very fire it started. Reeser had cigarettes and barbiturates. Bentley had a pipe and matches. Faherty had an open fireplace. Jeannie Saffin's father was smoking a pipe while she sat in a nylon cardigan. Mott was a smoker on an oxygen tank. Nolan was carrying 2 lighters. The pattern is not no ignition. The pattern is ignition was present, and the fire that destroyed the body also destroyed the easy proof of ignition. No spontaneous combustion case has ever produced actual proof of absence of an ignition source. This is the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence, and it is the difference on which the entire category stands or falls. And yet, position 3 exists for a reason. The wick effect is a powerful mechanism for how an already ignited body burns. It is not, by itself, an explanation for what ignites it. In a handful of cases, the ignition source remains genuinely unknown, and there are 4 details in 300 years of casework that nobody has explained. The first is the Krogman skull. No fire experiment has ever reproduced the exact teacup-sized cranium described in the Reeser file. Joe Nickell has a reading that it was charred neck tissue mistaken for bone, but nobody has actually put that reading in a controlled fire to test it. The second is Larry Arnold's claim that spontaneous combustion cases cluster geographically in specific corridors of the English Midlands and the American Northeast. The claim has never been tested by a statistician in a peer-reviewed paper. It might dissolve under demographic analysis. It might not. We do not know because nobody has done the work. The third is the Henry Thomas case, where the skull survived but the pelvis did not. That is the reverse of the standard wick effect outcome, and no forensic anthropologist has explained the inversion. And the fourth is the Jeannie Saffin case, where her own father sat 2 feet away and saw nothing before the flash of light. These gaps do not return us to "it was supernatural." They return us to a more honest position. The wick effect explains a lot. It does not explain everything. The mature scientific stance is to say so. What these cases actually reveal is how poorly we still understand fire, how a slow, patient burn can reduce 170 pounds of bone, muscle, and memory to a handful of ash and a single slipper, while the newspapers on the table wait, unburned, for a reader who will never come back. 3 centuries of the same shape and the same question, with the answer assembling itself slowly, one wick experiment at a time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the strangest corner of forensic fire science, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment with the case that unsettles you most, and I will see you in the next one.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to visit crazyalchemist.com for more intriguing content and follow Crazy Alchemist on Instagram and Facebook to stay connected.